Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'rith. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Today, we're exploring a powerful story of lifelong friendship, resilience, and Jewish identity that has stood the test of time. My guest, author Eric Reisman, brings this remarkable history to life in his poignant book, The Boys from the Bronx, a story of brotherly love forged in war. But before we get into today's conversation, a quick reminder. If you enjoy this program, subscribe to Conversations with B'rith wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook to stay updated with all of our latest content. In 1938, a group of 11-year-old boys from the East Bronx formed the Knights of Troy, later known as the Trojan Athletic Club. What started as a simple sports club grew into something far greater, a lifelong brotherhood that endured through World War II and beyond. Their story, told through wartime letters and personal interviews, is a testament to the power of friendship, shared history, and the values that connected them for over 70 years. Eric Reisman, a retired special educator and first-time author, wrote The Boys from the Bronx to preserve this extraordinary history. Inspired by his father, Bernie Reisman, one of the club's founding members and a beloved professor at Brandeis University, Eric weaves together letters, memories, and interviews to honor these cherished friendships. He continues this work by connecting with relatives and leading a second-generation group to preserve their legacy. Eric, welcome to Conversations with B'rith.
Thank you, Dan. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, before we start in with this conversation, let's begin with the backstory. So the backstory is that Eric's father, Professor Bernie Reisman, directed the graduate program in Jewish communal service at Brandeis University for many years. That program is very dear to me as I'm a graduate of it. Bernie was a seminal figure in his field and is remembered dearly by those who studied under him and worked with him and knew him. Bernie was my mentor and my friend. We shared, though, something different than the subject matter we were studying. We shared an intense interest in American Jewish athletes, and in the pre-internet era, would exchange clippings. Remember those days? You couldn't send it any other way. You'd take a clipping out of the newspaper. And the clippings would be about the exploits and accomplishments of Jewish baseball players and tennis players and golfers and a host of others. So I say all of this as a tribute to my mentor and as a prelude to our conversation today. So Eric, again, great to have you with us. So I'm thrilled that you're here to discuss your book, The Boys from the Bronx. Tell us about the origins of the Knights of Troy, later known as the Trojan Athletic Club. Who organized it? Who participated? And were all of them Jewish?
So thanks, Dan. Great to be here. It's extra special because you knew my dad, and I know how special that relationship was. And it means so much to me that now you and I are continuing that relationship and sharing the Jewish athletes that we know of. And that's just love it. Absolutely love it. So the Trojans, they started off as the Trojans, later changing their name when they found out what a Trojan was, because they did not want to be associated with that. Back in the 1930s, there were lots of these neighborhood clubs that were gathering together as athletic clubs. And they were playing stickball, football, baseball, basketball, all the sports. And the club came together with the idea of, we're going to find the best athletes in this neighborhood, and we're going to start our own club. And they started in 1938. As a matter of fact, February 28th, 1938. So tonight, I am hosting a second-generation Zoom meeting with our members, and so I'm very excited about that. And this group was like any other athletic group, except that they were different in the sense of there being a real community of guys. They had weekly meetings. They had dues. You had to get voted into the club, and you were expected to go to the meetings. There was certain behavior also that was expected of you. And the club was started when they were 11 and 12 years old. When they were 16, about 6 months after Pearl Harbor, which I thought was interesting timing, they wrote a constitution that guided their behavior and explained about the officers. They always had officers. They had a president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. I mean, they were an organized group. I think most of the other athletic groups that they played against were just kids that got together and played ball. I think that this group was different in that sense. And my dad had a lot to do with it. And I think also my grandfather had a lot to do with it because he helped with guiding them, but they always wanted to be on their own. They didn't want any adults telling them how to run their show.
So the story begins. Go ahead.
I was going to say the interesting part to me was the book started off as me looking at what were the influences in my father's life that shaped his life. Why did he become a professor working with communities, building communities? And I realized that it was because of having the Trojans and coming from a big Jewish family. His mother was one of 11 and his father was one of 8. So he couldn't walk out the door without bumping into a relative.
Speaking of large Jewish families, the larger Jewish family was in the Bronx. And the story begins in the Bronx. What was their neighborhood like? Well, we know there was a strong Jewish presence there. The Jewish population of the Bronx in those days was quite significant. The neighborhood must have also helped to shape who he was.
Yeah, very large Jewish population, large Italian population. So the group was not just all Jewish guys, Jewish and Italian. And the neighborhood was middle class, middle working class, a lot of immigrants that had come over from Europe. And they were all trying to establish themselves in the community, but everybody knew each other. The parents knew the kids, and they all liked the fact that they were part of this group. These were the good kids. These were not the kids going off getting in trouble. They were playing ball. They were having these meetings. They were mischievous. And they certainly had their fair share of things that they did, but they were not fighting. They were not nasty kids. These were all gentle men. They exterior, as this is how we all grew up. None of the guys would ever say, "Oh, I love you," but the love of those guys was so strong and so palatable that there was no question of their love for each other. And but it was all covered up by calling each other nasty names and hitting each other.
Well, that's what 11 and 12-year-olds, they still do that, by the way.
Absolutely.
They still do it.
Absolutely.
Your father plays, as you said, a major role in this book, even though few of his own letters, if any, are included. Tell us about the letters exchanged by members of the Knights of Troy during World War II, offer an incredible firsthand account of that time. As you compiled them, and tell us how you compiled those letters, what stood out to you the most? Were there any letters that surprised you or emotionally moved you, or even changed your perspective on that moment, on that time?
So I had been writing the book for about 4.5 years when my mother gave me this notebook of letters. And at first, I was just overwhelmed by it. There were over 100 letters. I had no idea what to do with it. I skimmed through some of them, and I just was at a loss because it was just overwhelming. Then I had dinner with 2 of my buddies who said to me, as I explained about these letters, they said, "Oh my gosh, That is your story. This is primary source material, and you got to use these letters. So the letters to me told that they were all, many from the 1940s, letters written by the guys to my dad. My dad was sort of the main person that that people wrote to because they couldn't write to everyone. The group was about 25 to 30 guys, and you couldn't write individual letters to each of them. So he wrote to one guy, and that was my dad. And then my dad shared those letters with the other guys and posted them up in the clubhouse so that people could see the letters. What I got from the letters was these were 18-year-old boys, horny boys, going off to war, no clue about what they were about to get into. They discovered anti-Semitism, which they had not had in their neighborhood because there were, it was mainly a Jewish neighborhood, very tolerant of other cultures. But they got into war where these guys were meeting Jews for the first time. So they were probably expecting horns, and there were a number of references to anti-Semitic comments. And my favorite letter of all of them was a letter that started off, "Dear prick," and ends with, "You stupid prick." And in between is this beautiful love letter between two guys who really care about each other. Leo Cooper was in the Marine Corps at that time. And my dad had I think had signed up. The date is vague on that one, but my dad had enlisted and was waiting for his orders. And Leo says to him, "What is your hurry? I am lonely. I'm sick. I don't want to be here. I'm scared." And so, what's your hurry? If I was there, Bern, I'd knock some sense into you. Don't rush into this thing because it's horrible. And then at the end, to cover up his real feelings, he says, "You stupid prick." But again, I love that letter because it is so powerful, so full of love, and one brother saying to the other, "Hey man, I'm concerned about you."
So they've gone from 11 and 12-year-olds where they're kind of pushing each other around, but like each other a lot, to adults at the age of 18.
Forced to be adults.
Forced to be adults.
Forced exactly. To be adults because they've got to go into war. And
you think that their Jewish upbringing or values came through in any way in all of this? I mean, they were raised obviously to be good kids, and that's good in any family. But do you think there was something special about the Jewish experience that these guys had, living in a big Jewish neighborhood, surrounded by large Jewish families, Jewish traditions, Jewish holidays, and so forth? Did that have an impact, do you think?
Well, so I would say yes, the Jewish values were there for them. They certainly knew that it was their patriotic duty to go to war. And because of that patriotism, because of the value that their parents instilled in them, the Jewish values of, this is your patriotic duty, you need to do it for your country, and you do it to be with your brothers. None of the guys were in the same units. They were all scattered throughout Europe. So they were not together. But I think that the letters in particular were their life raft. They knew that their brothers, their Jewish brothers, their Trojan brothers, were there for them and would understand how they felt. They couldn't talk to the guys in the bunk because you can't say to the guys in the bunk, "Hey, I miss my gang. I miss the guys. I want to go home and play pinochle and baseball." "Come on, what's wrong? We're just some kind of sissy. Come on."
Yeah.
But they knew that they could write letters to their buddies and say how scared they were, how much they didn't want to be there.
Your commentary throughout the book, which is quite empathetic, really adds depth to the letters. You reflect on your own understanding of growing up, while these boys who had been quite sheltered had to mature almost overnight, as we said. How do the letters express this sudden and in many ways painful shift into adulthood? Do they when they're writing, they talk not only about missing each other, but do they talk about their families, that they're worried that their families will worry about them? I mean, all of these things are adult considerations, and yet here they are again, really just out of boyhood and into manhood.
What's interesting is, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the letters. Some of the guys start off so empathetically about the other guy that they're writing about, like writing to my dad, worried about him and how things are back home, worried about one of the things that almost every single guy did. I'm so sorry I didn't respond sooner to your letter. Mm. They were so concerned about responding quickly to each of the guys. And they just had an amazing empathy for each other. And empathy in the midst of the worst possible scenario, they're thinking about their buddies and not necessarily just where they were.
Did you come across any letters that reference Jewish identity? In other words, they're in the armed forces. Was it some Jewish traditions, humor? You mentioned the anti-Semitism, shared cultural experiences. Did that come through at all?
Not really, but the thing that comes to mind is Leo Cooper's letter, Dear Prick. In that letter, he talks about a superior officer calling him a kike, or calling him an anti-Semitic word. I can't remember actually now exactly what it was. And the two of them went off to the woods to fight. They had a physical fight. And in the end, Leo sort of got off with a slap on the wrist, and the superior officer got knocked down to private because of his anti-Semitic comments that he made.
So as we move into the post-war years, how do the letters change? Now they're getting older. It's the old gang, but they must be now on the verge of getting married, about to get married, having families. So how did it change this correspondence, not just in content, but also in tone and style and other ways? And what stood out to you about this shift as time moves on?
So one of the things that most stood out was the lack of ability to talk about the war. Never discuss the war. There's one member who's still alive, 98 years old, Billy Rosenzweig. Love this guy. He is as sharp as could be. When I sent him the letters, he said to me, I had no idea where these guys were stationed, and I didn't know half the stories that were told. Because what happened was when they came back, they never talked about it. And that to me was really striking. Of the group, they only lost one member in the war, Howie Greenberg. And no one talked about it because I think it was just too scary to even think about the fact that one of their own had died in the war. And how do you process that? You know, how do you, as a 20-year-old guy who's just come back and seen horrible things, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to relive it. I don't want to share it with the guys, when that could have been very healing, I think, to share the
You extend the narrative beyond the club's golden anniversary in 1988, 50 years, all the way through 2004. When did you begin interviewing your father's friends? Because already they're getting old. Were they excited about the prospect that you were doing this book? And what was it like interviewing your dad? That must have been a tremendous experience. Tell us about it.
So in 2004, I went out to San Diego for their 66th reunion. At that point, the book was not even an inkling, not even a thought. I went out, I was actually at a video production company at that point, and I went out with my cameras thinking that I was going to make an award-winning documentary that was going to be on PBS about this group. It was just rich with so much, I loved being out there. And I didn't really know what I was doing when I went out there with my cameras, but I knew that I had to document this event. And so in interviewing the guys, again, with no idea of putting together a book, but possibly putting together something that talked about their reunion, the guys, it was more about how did you join up with a group, and what are some of your memories? The thing that came through with every single guy that you interviewed, they said, and not just because I was the guy behind the camera, they said, your dad, it was your dad. If it wasn't for your dad keeping us together, this group would not still be as strong as it is. Your dad was the one that brought us together, the convener, and because of what he learned in this group, he came up with all these terms. Convener. You have to have a convener that brings the group together. And he was the guy.
Well, that was so much connected also to his academic and his professional work. He was the master convener, that doesn't surprise me. But your dad also was a great conversationalist. He to me, he could make anything sound interesting, and he didn't hold back. So interviewing him, obviously central to this book because he's the central figure, that really must have been essential to putting all of this together.
Actually not. So it's interesting that you say that. His interview was not that essential to putting together the book. At that point in 2004, he was in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, and he was on the decline. We were very concerned about him going out to that reunion because we didn't quite know how he was going to be. He was repeating himself a lot, and he was not as sharp as he was. However, being with the guys raised him to a different level. He was so spot on. One of my favorite stories to tell is on the last day of the weekend, the group all got together at one of the guys' houses, and they were having there were 30, 40 people in a room, husbands and wives. And Mike Elhanty, one of the funniest guys of the group, is leading and says to the guys, we're going to do our Reisman circle, everyone gets a chance to talk. And Bernie, I don't want to tell you what to say here, but he starts whispering in his ear. It cracked me up. My dad starts to speak. He says, and when we first looked at him, we were all very concerned. Is he going to do okay? Is he going to rise to the occasion? He says, I'm starting to feel like I'm going to cry. You guys are my brothers, and I'm so grateful to be here. And he launched into a beautiful speech that was so touching and so spot on. Mike looks at my mom. My mom's sitting next to my dad, and he kind of goes behind her back and says, we got him. But because he was with his guys, it just raised him to the next level.
It comes across to me, Eric, as these guys got into middle age and old age, that this was much more than nostalgia. Because nostalgia plays a big role. All of us, when we go back to high school reunions, I go back every 5 years, and I've even had a first grade reunion with some of our first grade classmates. And nostalgia is very important for all kinds of reasons. But this was more than that. What do you believe the club represented for its members? And what did the boys who grew into men learn from the lasting bonds that they forged, despite their differences in education and interest? Of course, sports was a common denominator for these guys from the get-go. But they had led different lives. And yet the club was important for all kinds of reasons. Tell us what you think about that.
So that amazing brotherly love. They came together through sports. Sports is often a real bonding experience because you go through highs and lows. and you go through it together. And I think that over the course of the 7 years before they went to the war, they developed such a strong bond in a couple of ways. Because they grew confident that they could run this group on their own without adult help. And they set up this group, set up the rules. I'm sure they got some guidance from my grandfather and possibly from others. But they did it. And they did it together. And they did it as a group in an organized way. And I had these meetings that if you were late, you were charged a nickel. If you swore, you were charged a nickel. So they were taught from the start responsibility, ownership of, if you screw up, you gotta own up to it. And they had committees and they had guys doing stuff. They got very politically involved later on. But the bond that they forged together was amazing.
I'm very impressed I'm sure they didn't call it this then when they were 12 years old, but I am impressed by the self-discipline. This was New York City. And New York City is, the life was lived not only in the apartments, life was lived in the streets. The ultimate urban culture. And yet, here's a bunch of guys who had this self-discipline they imposed, and that worked. I think it said a lot about their own upbringing, of course, the values that their parents imparted to them. And by that, I don't mean that they sat these guys down at some point at the age of 10 to say, well, here's a list of values. But it's how their parents lived as well, and that was imparted to them. I'm curious, because you said this at the outset, you really wanted to find out, in a way, even though you were very close to your father, what made him tick. Did this deep dive into the past change the way that you see and think about your father?
Well, I'll tell tales because he's not alive, so he can't. Yes, it changed my view a little bit about him. I learned that he was quite the ladies' man. When I talked to Billy about it, he said, "Oh, yeah, your dad was quite the ladies' man. He was a makeout king. But don't tell your mother." This was like a couple of years ago. Like, Billy, come on, and they lived together for so many years. She must have known. But it really gave me an understanding of how he came into who he was, building community. That was his thing. His thing was connecting people because he saw the value in being part of this group and how much it meant to all the members of the group, and how that 50 years and 60 years later, these guys are still talking about the importance of being part of that group and what it meant to them. I'm very lucky. I've got a group of guys that have been together for more than 50 years. My high school cross-country team. These guys are my brothers. And because I had the role model of my father's group, I was able to find my own group. And it's just meant so much to me. It's changed my life. It's made me an empathetic person. Two things that I would say about that. Number one, the group, the Trojans lost one guy in the war, an 18-year-old kid, senseless death. My best friend from high school on the cross-country team died of a brain tumor at age 22. Senseless death that makes no sense, that I think bonded us together in the pain of that loss. And because of that is kind of keeping us together.
Well, your father's legacy is immense. I mean, he trained generations of Jewish communal leaders, a whole raft of Jewish professionals who have devoted their professional lives to community. So that legacy, which showed up in as 11 or a 12-year-old in the Bronx, that idea of community certainly lives on. So you think then that your upbringing was influenced by your father's lifelong connection to the club, and you see yourself, because you've got the second generation group, you see yourself as part of that. Have you compared notes? And I'm sure you do, but I'm going to ask the question with your counterparts, the sons and the daughters of the other members of the club. And do they say the same kinds of things about having the club shaping their lives? Is that what you hear from them when you talk to them?
I'll have to think about that for tonight when I'm with the group, because I don't. Here's what's really interesting, though, is Mike Alhanty, great guy, actually came to Brandeis once to talk about the group. When I interviewed him, that was one of the highlights of his life. Professor Reisman asked him to come and talk to his class, and Mike hadn't gone into college, so he felt like he was a star, Mike's daughter, Iris, and I are the two that really have sort of kept the second generation together. And my father and Mike were the two guys that kept the club together and did a lot together. So it's been very interesting to see how Iris and I have worked together, and without even talking about that or without even planning it that way, it's just sort of happened. And it's a beautiful thing. I mean, I'm loving it. I also love the fact that I carry a lot of my father's characteristics and traits with me. And I love it when people say I look like him. I take that as a high compliment. Today, I'm wearing this red sweater because that's his famous red sweater. I'm wearing a Brandeis shirt underneath. I'm very purposeful in things that I wear when I wear them. So I wore this on purpose. But those are lots of the things that I got from him. I never wanted to be him. I never wanted to be a professor at Brandeis, and I never went to Brandeis. But as a doctor, a dentist, I didn't want to go into his practice. But I have become him in the things that I do, in the values that I do, in the things that I taught and teach in life. There's no question that I've taken on his values with pride, with great pride.
Final question. What do you hope readers of The Boys from the Bronx and viewers of this interview will take away from the story that you've told?
The importance of being part of a group, the importance of finding who are your people, where are they? Doesn't matter what kind of a group you could join: sports, chess, drama, religious groups, any group that you can be a part of so that you're connected. I was with a buddy yesterday who recently is separated from his wife of many years, and he talked about loneliness. And I've been so lucky in my life not to feel that in a major way. We all feel lonely at times, but I just feel it's so important to find your group, to find those things that you like doing, sticking with them, and sticking with those people, because it just will change your life. In having that, 50 years later, I got these guys. I got my guys, and I'm just so grateful to have them. I'm so grateful to stay connected with you, Dan. It just keeps me connected with my dad, and just means a lot.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for joining us for this. The book is The Boys from the Bronx, a story of brotherly love forged in war and peace by Eric Reisman. It's available now on bookshop.org, Amazon, and other retailers. Eric, thanks again for taking us inside The Boys from the Bronx and sharing the history, the brotherhood, and personal connections that make this story so powerful. Wishing you continued success with the book.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Conversations with B'nai B'rith. A big thank you to author Eric Reisman for sharing the deeply personal story of the Knights of Troy, a tale of lifelong friendship, brotherly love, and Jewish identity forged in war. And of course, thank you to our viewers for tuning in today. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with others, post about it on social media, or leave us a comment or rating. To stay updated, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for more great content. We'll be back soon with more important discussions on Jewish history, culture, and issues that matter most to our community and beyond. Until then, for my guest, Eric Reisman, this is your host, Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone.